40 German infantry were pushing up the ridge, and Private First Class Daniel Mercer was the only American still firing. He had one Browning automatic rifle, 7 magazines, and maybe 3 minutes before they overran the position. The rest of his platoon had already fallen back through the tree line behind him after an MG-42 opened from the right flank. Mercer hadn't retreated with them, not because he was brave, because if he moved now, and the Germans would crest the ridge and fire straight into the withdrawing Americans below. Snow and dirt kicked into his face as incoming rounds snapped through pine trunks above him. The German advance wasn't cautious anymore. It was aggressive. They believed the American line had collapsed. He could see them clearly between the trees now, spreading into assault formation. One machine gun team setting up behind a stump. 2 riflemen bounding left to flank. Others advancing in staggered pairs. But this wasn't a probing attack. It was a push to break through. Mercer checked his ammunition without lifting his head. 7 magazines, 20 rounds each. No assistant gunner, no radio, no one covering his left. 50 yards behind him, American boots were still retreating through churned snow. If the Germans reached the crest within the next minute, they would have clean enfilade fire on the withdrawing line. That meant dead Americans in open ground. But the first group of Germans stepped into a thin clearing near the ridge slope. Mercer didn't fire immediately. He waited until they believed the position was empty, until their spacing widened, until their confidence showed in their stride. Then he squeezed the BAR's trigger in tight, disciplined bursts. The automatic rifle hammered against his shoulder, brass ejecting into frozen mud. 2 Germans dropped before they even understood where the fire came from. The rest hit the ground instantly, they scrambling for cover and shouting orders. For 8 seconds, the advance stopped. Then the machine gun found him. The MG-42 opened with a ripping metallic roar that chewed through the earth inches from his bipod. Wood splinters exploded around his position. Dirt sprayed across his face. 40 rifles began pivoting toward the single muzzle flash holding the ridge. He had made them stop. Now he had to make them believe there were more than one of him. Mercer rolled 2 feet to his right before the next MG-42 burst, shredded the dirt where his muzzle flash had been. He didn't fire back immediately. If he kept shooting from the same position, they would triangulate him within seconds. Instead, he crawled low behind a fallen pine trunk 10 yards downslope, dragging the BAR by its sling and keeping his body flat against the frozen earth. The Germans were shouting to each other now, trying to identify how many Americans were still on the ridge. And that uncertainty was the only advantage he had. He popped up from the new position and fired a short burst from a different angle, sweeping left instead of center. One German who had begun rising to rush forward collapsed mid-stride. Mercer immediately stopped firing again. Silence after contact creates confusion. To the Germans, it no longer sounded like one fixed gun. It sounded like staggered defensive fire. He waited 3 seconds, then fired again from slightly behind the log, and adjusting his muzzle direction just enough to suggest crossfire. The goal wasn't to kill all 40. It was to slow them, force them to hug cover, and buy time for the Americans pulling back below. The MG-42 shifted fire toward his second muzzle flash, ripping apart the fallen pine. Bark and splinters flew across his helmet. Mercer counted rounds instinctively. Short bursts only, never more than 4 seconds. 20 rounds per magazine meant he could not afford long suppressive sprays. Chansey swapped magazines smoothly, keeping his body pressed tight to the ground. 6 left. That was roughly 120 rounds. At disciplined bursts, maybe 2 to 3 minutes of sustained disruption. No more. The Germans adjusted tactics quickly. 2 squads split wider to flank the ridge from both sides. If they reached his blind angles, it would be over. Mercer understood the pattern. They would suppress frontally with the MG-42, while riflemen crawled around his right and left, and he had seconds before that happened. He fired another burst deliberately higher than before, chewing through branches above German heads. It wasn't meant to hit. It was meant to pin. Suppression is psychological before it's lethal. For a moment, the ridge held. German movement slowed again. They were uncertain now, unsure how many Americans were still dug in, unsure whether reinforcements were hidden behind the crest. But uncertainty doesn't last long in combat. Through the trees on his far right, he saw movement. 3 German soldiers slipping low, attempting to crawl into a shallow depression that would give them a firing angle on his flank. If they reached it, the illusion would collapse. He had to stop them before they realized he was alone. The 3 Germans on his right were moving intelligently, low, patient, using shell craters and broken roots for cover. They weren't rushing. They were hunting. Mercer shifted his weight slowly, angling the BAR toward their movement, without exposing his full silhouette. The MG-42 resumed suppressive fire from the front, stitching the ridge with bursts designed to keep his head down, while the flanking element closed distance. Dirt jumped inches from his hands. Yet he couldn't stay where he was much longer. If those 3 reached the depression 20 yards out, they would have a clear lateral shot into his position. He made a decision in less than 2 seconds. Instead of staying pinned and waiting for them to complete the maneuver, he fired first. A sharp, controlled burst tore into the shallow depression just ahead of their path. 1 German jerked backward immediately, rifle slipping from his hands. The other 2 flattened hard against the ground. Mercer shifted slightly and fired again, this time shorter, just enough to keep them frozen. He didn't need to kill both. He needed them convinced that multiple Americans were covering that flank. The MG-42 shifted toward his new muzzle flash almost instantly. A long burst chewed across the ridge, forcing him to roll behind the log again. A round clipped the edge of his helmet, ringing his ears with a sharp metallic crack. He tasted dirt and cordite. He swapped magazines again. 5 left. 100 rounds, maybe less if he lost count. His breathing was steady, but the math was brutal. 40 Germans still below, 2 flanking right. Unknown movement left. Machine gun front. No reinforcements. Through the noise, he heard something else. Shouted German commands growing more aggressive. They were realizing the fire pattern wasn't consistent with a full American squad. It was too controlled, too spaced. A seasoned NCO would start counting bursts, counting pauses, realizing there was only one primary automatic weapon. The illusion was thinning. Mercer couldn't let them settle into coordinated pressure. He shifted tactics. Instead of staying prone, he rose to one knee briefly and unleashed a longer burst sweeping across the center of their formation, deliberately exposing himself for 2 seconds to project confidence. 2 more Germans dropped as the line recoiled. Then he immediately dropped flat and rolled downslope 5 yards to a secondary indentation he had spotted earlier. The sudden movement reinforced the idea of multiple firing positions. But the risk was real now. One rifleman caught a glimpse of his reposition and fired. A round tore through his sleeve, grazing his upper arm. Heat flashed through muscle, but the limb still functioned. He ignored the pain. He had to. 4 magazines left. The Germans were adjusting again. Wider spread now, a slower advance, more disciplined. They weren't charging blindly anymore. They were preparing to overwhelm him methodically. The ridge had gone from chaotic to calculated. The Germans were no longer rushing. They were tightening the perimeter. Mercer could see it in their spacing. 2 men suppressed from the front while others shifted incrementally through cover. The MG-42 fired shorter, more disciplined bursts now. Not to kill him immediately, but to keep him locked in place while the encirclement formed. They were done testing. They were finishing. Mercer pressed his cheek against the stock and forced himself to slow down. Panic wastes ammunition. He had 4 magazines left, 80 rounds. At controlled 3 to 5 round bursts, that was perhaps 20 effective engagements if he didn't miss, against 40 men. The numbers didn't favor him, but terrain did. The ridge forced them upward through limited lanes. If he chose those lanes carefully, each burst could hit more than one target, or at least stop multiple bodies from moving. A shadow flickered in his left peripheral vision. 2 Germans had begun climbing along a shallow gully that cut diagonally toward the crest. If they reached the top, they would have a plunging angle directly into his position. Mercer adjusted and fired a tight burst into the mouth of the gully. 1 soldier collapsed forward, sliding back down. The second retreated behind rock cover. That flank paused, but only briefly. The MG-42 opened again, heavier this time. The bark of the weapon tore through the forest like ripping canvas. A sustained burst walked across the ridge line, striking closer than before. One round punched into the log shielding his lower torso, splintering wood inches from his ribs. The machine gun team was bracketing him now, adjusting elevation and windage with frightening precision. They had found his general arc. Mercer knew he couldn't win a static exchange. If he stayed fixed, they would inch closer until grenades ended it. So he did something reckless. He stopped firing entirely. For 3 seconds, there was no American return fire. The Germans hesitated, uncertain whether they had finally neutralized the last gunner. One squad began to rise cautiously, testing the silence. Mercer counted under his breath. 1, 2, 3. And then he erupted upward from a new position, 5 yards left of where they last saw him, and emptied half a magazine into the standing figures. 2 fell immediately. The rest dove for cover, them shouting in confusion. The sudden reappearance from a different angle reignited the illusion. It sounded like at least 2 BARs alternating fire. Mercer dropped back down and slammed a fresh magazine into the weapon. 3 left, 60 rounds. He could hear them closer now. Boots crunching snow, low commands in German, metal clanking as grenades were readied. The distance between him and the nearest rifleman had shrunk to maybe 30 yards. At that range, they wouldn't need perfect aim. Volume alone could overwhelm him. A grenade landed 10 yards short and detonated, spraying frozen earth across his back. Another bounced off a root and rolled farther downslope. They were probing, testing arcs. Mercer wiped dirt from his eyes and steadied the BAR again. 3 magazines. Less than a minute before they tried to rush him for real. The grenade blasts were no longer probing. They were tightening. Mercer heard the shift before he saw it. The MG-42 went silent. That was the signal. When suppressive fire stops suddenly, it means the assault element is moving. He lifted his head just enough to see gray shapes breaking from cover in a coordinated push. Rifles forward, boots driving hard through churned snow. This wasn't cautious anymore. This was the overrun attempt. The first wave came straight up the center. They 5 men bounding in pairs while 2 others angled left to flank. Mercer didn't spray wildly. He waited until the lead pair cleared a cluster of low brush and exposed themselves fully on the slope. Then he fired a brutal, sustained burst longer than any he had used so far. The BAR bucked against his shoulder, muzzle climbing, as he walked rounds across their advance. 2 fell instantly. A third stumbled and rolled backward down the incline. The charge faltered, but only for a second. Return fire exploded toward him from 3 directions at once. Bullets snapped past his ears. A round punched through the dirt inches from his face. He shifted positions again, rolling downslope behind a shallow indentation he had memorized earlier. His arm throbbed where the earlier graze had torn fabric, but it still functioned. He jammed a fresh magazine into the bar. 2 left, 40 rounds. The Germans adjusted mid-charge, dropping flat and crawling while others resumed suppressive fire. And they were closer now, Penestiai. 25 yards at most. Close enough that he could see their expressions between muzzle flashes. Close enough that hesitation meant death. Mercer forced himself to fire short, precise bursts instead of panic sprays. He targeted movement, not bodies. Anyone who rose to rush got immediate fire. Anyone who attempted to flank was met with rounds snapping across the ridge lip. But the numbers were starting to compress around him. On his right, a pair of Germans crawled behind a fallen tree and began inching upward, protected by angled fire from their comrades. On his left, at least 4 were now within grenade range. Another grenade arced through the trees and landed behind his previous firing position. The blast rocked the ridge, showering him with debris. If that grenade had landed 5 feet closer, this fight would have ended. The Germans were learning his rhythm. They were calculating pauses between bursts. He had 1 final magazine after this. 20 rounds, that was all. The machine gun resumed from below, not to suppress wildly, but to bracket the crest precisely. They were preparing 1 last coordinated push. Mercer realized something grim. If he kept firing from the same arc, they would swarm him. He needed shock, something to reset their momentum again. He shifted completely from the ridge lip and slid downslope 5 yards into partial view, exposing himself deliberately. And the move was dangerous, almost suicidal, but it changed the geometry. From that lower angle, he had a clearer line into the cluster preparing to rush. When they saw him move, several rose instinctively to adjust aim. That was the mistake. Mercer emptied the rest of the magazine into that exposed group in one relentless stream. The bar roared without pause. Brass spilled into the snow. 2 men collapsed. Others dropped flat in shock. The charge died again. He slammed in his last magazine. 20 rounds. The ridge was littered with bodies and churned earth. The Germans had not broken through, but they were still there. Still dozens. Still armed. And now they knew there was only one gun. The Germans had stopped charging, and that was worse. When soldiers stop rushing and begin coordinating, it means they understand the battlefield. Mercer could see it clearly now. No more scattered advances, no more impulsive pushes. They were spreading with discipline, tightening their angles, moving in short, controlled bounds while the MG-42 stitched precise, suppressive fire across the crest. They had counted his bursts, counted his pauses, counted his repositioning. But they knew there was only one automatic weapon holding that ridge. Mercer pressed his cheek to the stock and forced his breathing steady. 1 magazine remained. 20 rounds. That meant perhaps 5 disciplined bursts if he did not miss. After that, the bar would fall silent and 40 German infantry would finish the climb. The machine gun shifted lower, deliberately walking rounds across the ridge to fix him in place, while 2 assault elements began pushing from both flanks. On the left, 3 Germans sprinted through a narrow break in the trees, rifles forward, attempting to close to grenade range. Mercer waited until they fully committed into open ground, then fired a tight 4-round burst at chest height. The lead soldier collapsed instantly. The second stumbled and fell behind him. The third dove flat and crawled backward. 16 rounds remained. On the right, 2 riflemen advanced more cautiously, one kneeling to cover while the other moved. Mercer fired again, and shorter this time, snapping dirt and bark inches from their faces to pin them rather than kill. He could not waste ammunition. 12 rounds left, the MG-42 intensified, bark and splinters erupting near his position as German voices grew closer, close enough to hear boots crunching frozen earth and metal clicking as grenade pins were pulled. A grenade landed behind him and detonated, the concussion slamming into his ribs and filling his mouth with dirt and blood. His ears rang violently. Now, but he forced himself upright before they interpreted the blast as a kill. 10 rounds. The Germans prepared a synchronized rush now. He could see multiple figures crouched low, waiting for suppressive fire to cover a final surge. If they rushed together, 10 rounds would not be enough. He needed shock, something to break their nerve again. The MG-42 roared, and in that moment Mercer rose just high enough to be seen against the ridgeline. It was reckless and deliberate, that he swept the bar left to right on full, the final rounds tearing through branches and uniforms alike. 1 German dropped the mid-stride, another spun backward down the slope. The rest flattened instinctively, uncertain whether they were walking into crossfire. The BAR clicked empty. Silence hung over the ridge for a heartbeat. Mercer did not move. If he reached for another magazine, they would know he had none. German boots crunched closer. Voices shouted commands. Rifles lifted. Then, from 50 yards behind him, American rifle fire exploded forward. M1 Garands cracked in disciplined volleys as the platoon, having regrouped below, surged back into position. The Germans, already shaken by repeated failed rushes, and convinced moments earlier they were facing multiple guns, faltered under the renewed fire and began pulling back. Mercer remained prone, bar empty in his hands, as the assault dissolved into retreat. 40 men had tried to take the ridge. None reached the crest. He had not destroyed them alone. He had held them long enough for the line to reform. And in war, sometimes holding for 1 minute longer than the enemy expects, is the difference between collapse and survival. The firing didn't stop immediately. Even as the Germans began pulling back through the trees, American rifles continued snapping measured volleys over Mercer's head to ensure the withdrawal stayed a retreat and didn't turn into another push. Mercer finally rolled onto his back, staring up through splintered branches at a gray winter sky that looked strangely calm compared to the last 10 minutes. His right arm trembled from strain and blood loss where the round had torn through his sleeve. Like his shoulder burned from absorbing sustained recoil. The bar rested across his chest, bolt locked open, utterly empty. For a moment, he simply listened. Garands cracking, shouted commands, boots rushing past him as American infantry reoccupied the crest he had refused to abandon. A corporal slid down beside him and grabbed his web gear. "You still breathing?" Mercer nodded once, too drained to speak. The corporal glanced at the empty magazine well, and then toward the slope below where several German bodies lay scattered across churned snow and broken brush. He didn't say anything more. He didn't need to. The delay had worked. The platoon had reorganized 50 yards back, reformed its line, and counterpushed before the Germans could crest and pour fire into open ground. If Mercer had fallen back with the first withdrawal, the ridge would have been lost in under a minute. Instead, the Germans had hesitated again and again, convinced they were advancing into layered automatic fire rather than a single exhausted infantryman. An officer climbed up moments later, scanning the terrain before kneeling beside Mercer. "You held them?" Mercer swallowed hard and managed a quiet answer. "Long enough?" The officer looked downslope, then back at the ridge. "That's all we needed." There was no dramatic speech, no raised voice, just a simple recognition that the line had not broken. Behind them, stretcher bearers moved cautiously forward to retrieve wounded. Snow continued to fall lightly, settling over spent casings and torn earth, as if the forest were trying to erase what had happened. Mercer finally let his grip loosen from the BAR. His hands were stiff from cold and recoil. He had fired every round he carried. He had no reinforcements when he chose to stay. He had no certainty that help would return before the last magazine ran dry. What he had was time, measured in seconds, bought with controlled bursts and deliberate movement. 40 German troops had tried to take the ridge. They had not expected resistance to last more than a brief exchange. They had not expected one automatic rifle to keep reappearing from different angles. And they had not expected American rifles to rejoin the fight just as they prepared to overrun it. Later, when the ridge was secured and the platoon moved forward again, Mercer would walk with them. His arm bandaged, his ammunition replenished, the BAR reloaded. There would be no headline about the moment, no grand ceremony. Just another position held, another advance slowed, another day survived in the Ardennes. But among the men who had been pulling back that afternoon, there would be a quiet understanding. When the line nearly folded, one man stayed. When 40 advanced, one bar kept firing, and sometimes, in the chaos of World War II, that was enough to change how the battle unfolded. The Germans did not attempt another push that afternoon. Recon patrols later reported they had regrouped deeper in the tree line, reorganizing under the assumption they had encountered a reinforced American position rather than a single, stubborn holdout. That misconception mattered. In small unit warfare, perception often carries as much weight as firepower. Mercer's shifting angles, controlled bursts, and timed silences had built an illusion strong enough to distort enemy assessment. They believed they were facing multiple automatic weapons interlocking across the crest. That belief slowed their tempo. Slowed tempo gave Americans time. Time stabilized the line. By nightfall, the ridge had transformed from contested ground into a defensive anchor. Foxholes were dug deeper. Fields of fire were cleared deliberately. Machine guns repositioned with overlapping coverage. Mercer sat against a tree while a medic rewrapped his arm and checked his hearing, and the ringing had faded to a dull echo. He didn't speak much. Combat rarely feels heroic from the inside. It feels mechanical. Magazine, burst, shift, count, repeat. Only afterward does the scale become clear. 40 enemy infantry, one automatic rifle. Less than 10 minutes separating breakthrough from stabilization. Word moved quietly through the platoon by evening. Not exaggerated, not embellished, just the facts. When the line bent, one man did not. When the Germans rushed, the ridge answered back. When ammunition ran dry, reinforcements arrived seconds before collapse. In larger war summaries, such moments disappear inside maps and arrows. But on the ground, men remember the sound of a bar firing when they thought it had fallen silent. They remember the difference between retreating under fire and regrouping behind resistance. Mercer cleaned the bar after dark, wiping mud and residue from the receiver. The weapon had not jammed once. It had not overheated beyond control. It had simply done its job as long as ammunition fed it. That reliability, combined with discipline, had amplified one man's presence into something larger than reality. The Browning automatic rifle was never designed to win battles alone. It was designed to anchor infantry movement. That day, it anchored an entire platoon's survival. No headline would record the ridge by name. No battlefield map would circle the exact crest where he lay prone. No, but among the men who crossed that ground afterward, there was a quiet acknowledgement that sometimes the margin between collapse and defense is measured in a single decision. To stay when leaving would be easier. In World War II, countless positions were lost because hesitation arrived too soon. That ridge held because hesitation arrived on the other side first. By morning, the ridge looked ordinary again. Snow covered the churned earth. Spent brass was half buried beneath frost. The bodies had been cleared during the night. If someone walked the ground days later, they would see nothing but another stretch of Ardennes forest, scarred by artillery and footprints. But the men who stood there knew exactly how close it had come to folding. The German assault had not been reckless. It had been organized, deliberate, and confident. On 40 infantry moving with machine gun support against what they believed was a collapsing American position. On paper, that ridge should have fallen within minutes. What altered that outcome was not a hidden reserve force or sudden artillery strike. It was delay, measured in seconds, bought in bursts of 20 rounds at a time. Mercer never saw the full number advancing toward him in a single line. He saw fragments, shapes between trees, movement through brush, boots crunching snow. But he understood something instinctively that afternoon. If he stayed, the enemy would hesitate. If he hesitated, they would surge. That calculation shaped everything. Every reposition reinforced the illusion. Every pause suggested another gun waiting to fire. Every disciplined burst convinced them they were climbing into layered defense. By the time they realized it was only one Bayard, holding the crest, the opportunity had passed. The platoon advanced again later that day with the ridge secured. No ceremony marked the moment. No dramatic speech echoed through the trees. Just quiet acknowledgement in passing glances and tightened grips on rifles. War rarely announces its turning points. Often, they exist in brief spaces where collapse nearly happens but doesn't. In that narrow margin, individuals matter. Not because they defeat entire enemy forces alone, but because they refused to let momentum shift uncontested. Mercer would carry that afternoon with him long after the Ardennes campaign moved forward, not as a story of 40 defeated enemies, but as proof that one position, held at the right time, can reshape the immediate battlefield. The bar he carried was not the most advanced weapon of the war, nor the most feared, but in the hands of a man who understood terrain, timing, and discipline, it became more than hardware. It became time itself, time purchased for others to regroup, rearm, and return fire. In World War II, thousands of ridges changed hands without record. This one did not because it was strategically famous, but because one American gunner refused to let it fall in the minute that mattered most. And sometimes, in the chaos of global war, that single minute is the difference between retreat and resistance.